Show them who owns the grill. Bring out the premium spread from Indie Light. Keep it light, keep it effortless, and do what you love. Indie Light. Hello, friends. Late in the evening on June 22nd, 1882, a 38-year-old general stepped into a first-class carriage on the Brest to Moscow Express. His name was Mikhail Dmitrievich Skobelev, commander of the 4th Army Corps. He had just wrapped up military maneuvers in the Mogilev province and was heading out on leave. At that exact moment in time, there wasn't a single soul in Russia who didn't know his name. Even the empire's fiercest enemies whispered about the legendary White General. His battlefield exploits in Turkestan and at the siege of Plevna hadn't just made him famous. They had turned him into the living, breathing symbol of Russian military might. His officers absolutely worshipped him. The enlisted men in the trenches genuinely believed he was immortal. There were literal legends circulating among the troops that enemy bullets physically curved through the air to avoid hitting him. Skobelev's plan was simple. He was going to spend a few days in Moscow, tie up some loose ends, and head down to his country estate in the Ryazan region. He would never make it to that estate. On the night of June 25th, Mikhail Skobelev died completely out of nowhere in a Moscow hotel room. The official cause of death? Heart failure. Naturally, absolutely nobody believed that. The general was young. He was in the prime of his life. He had never complained about his health, and he had personally led the vanguard in some of the bloodiest, most meat-grinding battles of his era. His sudden death sent shockwaves across the entire European continent. Some people whispered that Skobelev had been quietly organizing a military coup, and the Tsar had him assassinated. Others swore it was a hit job by German intelligence. A third camp firmly believed he had accidentally stumbled onto a global Masonic conspiracy, and the secret societies had him silenced. But those are just the rumors. What is the actual truth? How exactly did one of Russia's most decorated generals, a man who was vastly more popular than the emperor himself, meet his end? That is exactly what we are going to untangle tonight. The idea to dig into Skobelev's story hit me while I was researching the twilight of Alexander II's reign and the dark dawn of Alexander III's rule. That transition of power is exactly when Skobelev died. And as I looked into it, two things blew my mind. First, the sheer unimaginable scale of his popularity. And second, how his death hit the public like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Literally, no one accepted it as a natural death. The entire nation assumed it was murder. For me, Skobelev had always been this mythological figure. The white general riding into the inferno of combat in a pristine white uniform. In my mind, he felt displaced in time, like he belonged somewhere between the Napoleonic Wars and the Russo-Turkish conflicts. He existed in this separate, legendary space in my head. But the reality is far more grounded and much more impressive. At just 38 years old, he became one of the youngest full generals of the infantry in the history of the Russian Empire. The man was a generational prodigy. Let's put him in context. Let's look at his generational map. He belonged to the exact same generation as Sergei Witte, the great reformist prime minister. He was contemporaries with Vyacheslav von Plehve, the notorious Minister of the Interior, who, if you remember, was assassinated in 1904. Witte was about 5 years younger than Skobelev and lived all the way to 1915. If this bizarre premature death hadn't happened, Skobelev would have absolutely lived to see the first Russian Revolution of 1905. He almost certainly would have commanded troops in the Russo-Japanese War. Just think about the sheer weight of history that fell squarely on the shoulders of this specific generation. The abolition of serfdom, the assassination of a czar, sweeping liberal reforms, crushing conservative counter-reforms, revolutions, and massive wars. It was a generation that forged the destiny of the nation. Skobelev's story gripped me, and I knew we had to dedicate a full episode to him. Let me paint a picture for you. March 1881. Skobelev is being given a hero's welcome in the city of Tsaritsyn, He is returning from a wildly successful military campaign in Central Asia. The banks of the Volga River are packed with tens of thousands of people, merchants, river haulers, factory workers. The moment the general's boot touches the pier, the crowd erupts into a massive roar. People are throwing their hats into the air. Women are tossing their scarves. From the docks all the way to the platform of his express train, a sea of euphoric humanity cheers his name. In Russia, that kind of overwhelming, visceral love was usually reserved for the emperor. But the truth was, the people didn't really love the emperor at that moment. Yes, 20 years earlier, Alexander II had abolished serfdom and pushed through liberal reforms. But 2 decades had passed, and the Tsar was now taking fire from all sides. The liberals blamed him for being too cautious, calling his reforms weak and compromised. The conservatives were furious, claiming he had given the peasant masses way too much freedom and destroyed the social order. On top of that, radical groups were constantly trying to murder the Tsar Liberator. We have a whole episode on him. He survived 6 assassination attempts, which is an absolute record for Russian monarchs, and probably for any European head of state. They shot at him 3 times. They tried to blow him up 3 times. Finally, in March of 1881, they succeeded. His son Alexander III took the throne, and his response to the terror was to adopt the most hardline conservative stance imaginable. He immediately rolled back all of his father's reforms. The brilliant, fiery politicians and charismatic military leaders were quietly pushed out, replaced by quiet, hyper-loyal bureaucrats whose only job was to execute imperial orders without question. Against that bleak, gray backdrop, Skobelev was a supernova. In Russian society, he was infinitely more popular than the new emperor. Every social class adored him. The aristocrats respected him because he had a spine. He wasn't afraid to stand his ground and defend his own opinions, a trait high society deeply valued. The military establishment loved him because he was a winner. He was one of them, a combat general who had never lost a single battle. They looked at him and saw the second coming of Suvorov. The enlisted men and the peasant class viewed him as their ultimate protector. His popularity reached such a fever pitch that traveling merchants were selling cheap woodblock prints of his face in remote villages. The peasants would buy these prints and place them right on their home altars, right next to the icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary. So where does this kind of universal worship come from? Let's answer that by pulling back the curtain on the life of the most popular general the Russian Empire ever produced. Entrepreneurs are facing new fires and new challenges every single day. That is exactly why it is critical to leverage every available opportunity to scale your business. To back strong, innovative projects across the country, Alpha Bank is relaunching its Fund for Not Small Business. The total prize pool has now been expanded to a massive 100 million rubles. Every single month, the fund selects 9 winners who get to actually choose the format of their prize. You could opt for direct financial backing to scale your current project. You could choose an exclusive educational program at the Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo. Or you could select a massive, fully funded advertising campaign featuring integrations with top-tier influencers. The winners are handpicked by a panel of heavy hitters, including Dennis Osen, the Director of Small and Micro Business at Alpha Bank, alongside a deep roster of highly successful entrepreneurs. If you are building a business, do not leave this on the table. Apply to the Fund for Not Small Business. The application is straightforward. Just pitch the unique value of your brand and provide the core details about yourself and your company. Plus, every single founder who submits an application gets instant free access to premium business training on the Alpha Course platform. I've dropped a link for you down in the description. Go click it right now. Mikhail Dmitrievich Skobelev was born on September 17, 1843 in St. Petersburg. He came from a hardcore military family. Both his father and his grandfather were generals in the Russian army. But the Skobelevs were not old money. They weren't born into the aristocracy. Mikhail's great-grandfather lived out in Orenburg and served as a non-commissioned officer. In the imperial table of ranks, that is the absolute bottom rung of the command ladder, the gritty connective tissue between the enlisted grunts and the actual commissioned officers. His grandfather Ivan Skobelev was the one who carved the family name into history. Ivan climbed the military ladder all the way from a private to a general of the infantry, from the very dirt of the trenches to the absolute summit of the Russian military hierarchy. The only rank above him was field marshal. And it was this grandfather who played a massive role in shaping the boy who would become our white general. Ivan Skobelev was a genuine certified Russian badass. As a young man, he volunteered for the Orenburg Dragoon Regiment. He served there for 10 years. He fought against Napoleon's forces in East Prussia. He survived the brutal meat grinder of the 1812 war, fighting at the legendary Battle of Borodino. He lost 2 fingers in the Russo-Turkish War. And then during the Polish campaign of 1831, his left arm was blown apart and had to be amputated at the shoulder. His response to losing a limb? He used to joke about it. He'd say, "To defend the Tsar and the fatherland, the fingers I have left are more than enough." Even after he made general, Ivan kept the rough, unpolished habits of a trench soldier. People who knew him wrote that he absolutely despised the shiny, ceremonial nonsense of high command. The strict requirement to wear a full-dress uniform in St. Petersburg drove him crazy. Whenever he could, he wore a simple, coarse soldier's tunic, throwing a standard-issue military overcoat over his shoulders when it got cold. Because of his rank, he was forced to spend a lot of time in the capital. But he hated the high society balls and the fancy dinner parties. He actively avoided them. Instead, he spent his free time out in the country, hanging out with the peasants, and inviting his old army buddies over. You can picture it. These scarred, battered veterans of the Napoleonic Wars sitting around for hours drinking tea, or something much stronger, and trading war stories. By the time he hit his 60s, Ivan Skobelev settled down in St. Petersburg and took the prestigious job of commandant of the Peter and Paul Fortress. At this point, his son Mikhail's father was constantly deployed on military campaigns, so the old general took his grandson, young Mikhail, under his wing. He started filling the kid's head with stories about the legendary Commander Suvorov, about the blood-soaked fields of Borodino. He read the boy his own written stories, collections of gritty soldiers' prose, military jokes, and trench humor. He hardwired 3 core principles into his grandson's brain. You must be brave. You must never spare yourself if the country needs you. And you must always, always respect the enlisted soldier. Ivan Skobelev passed away when his grandson was just 5 years old. After that, the boy's education was handed over to a German tutor. And this guy was brutal. He demanded absolute silence and perfect behavior. Whenever Mikhail acted up, the tutor beat him. Young Skobelev was an energetic, hyperactive kid, so he caught a lot of beatings. Later in life, people would joke that the general's deep-seated, lifelong hatred of the Germans started right there with that tutor. When Mikhail was 12, the German crossed a line. Mikhail had enough of the abuse and slapped the tutor right across the face. When his father found out, he immediately fired the German. But he also decided his son needed a change of scenery. You're probably thinking he sent him to a strict military academy. Nope. He shipped the boy off to a boarding school in Paris. The father genuinely believed Mikhail didn't have the discipline for the military. The kid had a weak physical constitution. His head was always in the clouds, and the father honestly didn't expect him to follow in the family trade. So Mikhail spent his teenage years in France. He returned to Russia in 1861 at the age of 17, right in the middle of Alexander II's massive social reforms. He passed his entrance exams with flying colors and enrolled in the mathematics department at St. Petersburg University. But his college career didn't last long. In February of that year, the Tsar abolished serfdom. By autumn, the university students were out in the streets, protesting against new academic rules and restrictions on free speech. The situation got so out of hand that the government temporarily shut the university down. For Mikhail, this was basically a sign from above. He had always secretly dreamed of a military career just like his father and his grandfather. With college out of the picture, he went down to the recruiting office and signed up as a cadet in the elite Cavalry Guards Regiment. His commission papers were personally signed by Emperor Alexander II, and Skobelev loved it. He immediately proved he was built for this life. His early military evaluations feature a specific telling phrase, "Serves with extreme zeal, sparing no effort." 2 years later, he earns his officer's epaulets and the rank of cornet. Right around this time, things are boiling over in the Kingdom of Poland. The Poles are demanding freedom of speech, freedom of the press. There is serious talk about restoring the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and not just a symbolic version, but pushing the borders all the way back to where they were in 1772. Poland is part of the Russian Empire, and St. Petersburg is not about to let that happen. The army is sent in to crush the rebellion. Skobelev gets assigned to a cozy staff job at the headquarters in Warsaw. He absolutely hates it. He refuses to ride out the war behind a desk. He demands a transfer to the Grodno Hussar Regiment. The Hussars were the tip of the spear. They were being used to form highly mobile flying columns to hunt down the insurgents. Riding with one of these lethal strike teams, Cornet Skobelev finally sees combat. He earns his first piece of hardware, the Order of St. Anne, 4th class, awarded strictly for bravery under fire. Not long after, Skobelev takes it upon himself to travel to Europe on his own dime. He wants to observe the war breaking out between Prussia and Denmark. What he sees there changes everything. He is completely blown away by how the Prussian army utilizes their cavalry. It is nothing like the Russian system. In Russia at that time, the cavalry was slowly turning into a parade ground ornament, a beautiful spectacle for when the emperor came to visit. Look at the hussars in their shiny uniforms trotting in perfect formation. But on the battlefields of the Prussian-Danish War, Skobelev saw the brutal modern reality of mounted warfare. When he gets back to his regiment, he immediately starts changing how they train. He forces his riders to jump massive ditches, clear high fences, charge up steep embankments, and swim their horses across rushing rivers. The old guard laughs at him. The senior officers are actually furious, complaining that this grueling training is ruining the appearance of their very expensive purebred horses. But Skobelev doesn't back down. He tells them point blank, when the shooting starts, the enemy isn't going to provide you with nicely paved roads. That trip to watch the Prussians fight was the turning point. It was the moment he decided to dedicate every fiber of his being to the art of war. But to get to the top, he needed to get into the General Staff Academy. That was the West Point of the Russian Empire, and getting in was brutally difficult. They only took 50 guys a year. The selection process was ruthless. You didn't just need to know math and geography, you had to master hardcore military sciences. Battlefield tactics, grand strategy, military topography, artillery, ballistics, and heavy fortification engineering. Mikhail Skobelev crushed every single exam. In 1866, he was accepted into the academy and spent the next 2 years grinding through the coursework. There is an amazing story from his time there. During his final practical exams, Skobelev was given a tactical problem. Find a suitable crossing point over the Niemen River. The instructors handed him a map, gave him a horse, and told him he had a few hours to scout the terrain, pick the best spot to ford the river, and plot it accurately on the map. A couple of hours later, the examining board rides out to check his work. They find Skobelev fast asleep under a tree. The officers are outraged. They are ready to expel him on the spot. A lazy, arrogant student who didn't even try to do the assignment. Skobelev wakes up, looks at them, and calmly explains that a competent cavalry officer should be able to force a river crossing literally anywhere. To prove his point, he gets on his horse, rides straight into the freezing, turbulent waters of the Neman, and swims the horse across to the other side, right in front of the stunned examiners. Then he shouts back across the water, "Did you see that?" and just keeps riding. Naturally, they passed him. After graduating from the academy, Skobelev is immediately assigned to the general staff. Everyone assumes he's going to stay in St. Petersburg, rub shoulders with the elite, and ride a gilded escalator to the top. But he demands to be sent to the active army. He knows you don't forge a real legacy sitting behind a mahogany desk. And in that era, the only place where the Russian Empire was actively shedding blood was Turkestan. Skobelev writes a letter directly to General von Kaufmann, the commander in Central Asia. Kaufmann is exactly the kind of guy who needs aggressive, high-energy officers. The empire is pushing deep into the frontier, marching on Khiva and Kokand. Skobelev begs to be let off the leash. "Take me," he writes. By the middle of 1868, he is on a train to Tashkent. When his friends ask him why he's going to the middle of nowhere, he gives a simple answer: either they kill me or I come back a general. He is 25 years old. Now let's set the stage in Central Asia. We're actually working on a massive deep dive episode about this right now. This is the era of the Great Game, the geopolitical collision between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. The British hold India, the crown jewel of their empire. They have troops in Afghanistan and operate it as a protectorate. London is terrified. They know that if Russia pushes through Central Asia, the next stop is Afghanistan. From there, the Russians would have a direct staging ground on the borders of India, putting them in a position to shatter British global dominance. If Britain loses India, they lose their superpower status. In 1864, the Russians take the city of Shymkent. The next year, Tashkent falls. 3 years later, General von Kaufmann captures Samarkand. The British aren't paranoid, they are entirely correct. The Russian Empire is rapidly swallowing the region. Obviously, the locals aren't exactly thrilled to see the Russians. Central Asia is already divided among 3 powerful entrenched states: the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanates of Kokand and Khiva. These are ancient medieval power structures. They have absolutely no intention of handing over their land. In early April 1868, the Emir of Bukhara declares a holy war against Russia. He fields a massive army of 50,000 men. General Kaufmann has exactly 4,000 soldiers. The Bukharan infantry and cavalry fight like demons, but the Russians have modern breech-loading rifles, superior artillery, and most importantly, iron discipline and modern tactical doctrine. By the summer of 1868, the Russians occupy Samarkand and start drawing up plans to strike at Khiva. This is exactly when Skobelev arrives in Turkestan. And what do they do with him? They stick him on staff duty. They look at him and say, "Hey, you're the smart kid from the St. Petersburg Academy. Go do some recon, study the terrain, draw us some nice maps." But Skobelev didn't ride thousands of miles to look at paper. He wants the adrenaline. He wants the risk. He wants the glory. In 1871, he is ordered to prepare a scouting operation. The mission is to assemble a small team cross the Caspian Sea and find a viable invasion route toward Khiva. The orders are very strict. Be extremely careful, stay completely under the radar, and do not push too deep into hostile territory. Skobelev decides to lead the mission himself, which, as a staff officer, he absolutely did not have to do. He takes a microscopic team, 3 Cossacks and 5 local Kyrgyz guides. They cross the sea and step right into the unforgiving desert. The wells on their map are dry. For 2 solid days, their horses don't get a drop of water. In 9 days, this tiny team drags themselves across 400 miles of brutal, scorching wasteland. Skobelev meticulously maps the route, logs the condition of every well, and confirms that Khiva is completely blind to an attack from this vector. For the intelligence he brings back, High Command gives him an official commendation. And for blatantly ignoring his orders and risking his life by going in person, They give him a severe reprimand and exile him back to his old desk job. The exile doesn't last long. By 1873, he is back in Turkestan, now carrying the rank of lieutenant colonel. The region is a powder keg. Turkmen raiders are systematically destroying Russian postal stations. Communications are completely severed. Trade is dead. The territory is slipping out of control, and High Command decides it needs to be violently brought to heel. Skobelev heads out again, this time commanding a strike force moving in from the Caspian Sea along the exact route he had personally mapped 2 years prior. 430 miles through deep sand in unimaginable heat. They march in the evening, they march through the night, they march in the early morning, and they hide from the lethal midday sun. Rations are short, water is running out. On May 21st, his troops storm and capture the city of Mangit. By May 26th, they are at the gates of Khiva. It takes them exactly 3 days to break the capital. For his sheer, unapologetic bravery under fire, Skobelev is promoted to full colonel and awarded the Order of St. George 4th Class. And, as is custom, he gets a nice vacation. By 1875, Skobelev is right back in Turkestan. The military is gearing up for a massive campaign against the Khanate of Kokand. The Russians had originally occupied this territory back in 1868. At the time, the local Khan bent the knee, agreed to Russian oversight, and tried to push through modern reforms. But his own army mutinied. They overthrew the Khan, slaughtered the Russian garrisons, and murdered every Russian citizen they could find. The Empire's response is to send in a heavy punitive expedition. Skobelev executes a masterclass in cavalry warfare at the Battle of Makram. With just 800 riders, he launches a devastating flanking maneuver that shatters the enemy line. The Khan's forces try to execute a tactical retreat, which immediately devolves into a panicked, chaotic rout. For this victory, Skobelev is awarded the Order of St. George 3rd Class. The Russian Empire annexes the territory of Namangan and all the land along the Syr Darya River. And the man chosen to be the military governor of this newly conquered land, Colonel Skobelev. Almost the second he takes the job, a massive rebellion breaks out in Andijan. Skobelev doesn't send a subordinate. He rides out, gets right up to the city walls under heavy enemy fire, personally sketches the layout of their fortifications, plots the exact vectors for the assault, and the very next day, Andijan falls. By January of the following year, Skobelev's forces smash their way into the capital city of Kokand. The entire Khanate is erased from the map, absorbed into the Russian Empire, and rebranded as the Fergana Oblast. For this string of explosive victories in Central Asia, Skobelev is promoted to Major General and presented with a ceremonial gold sword encrusted with diamonds. Keep in mind, guys, he is 32 years old at this point. Just over a year later, the Russo-Turkish War kicks off. And this is where we really have to applaud the infinite stupidity of the Russian bureaucratic machine. You would think the High Command would look at their roster and say, "Hey, we've got this undefeated, aggressive genius. Let's send him to fight the Turks." Right? Wrong. They bench him. The generals in St. Petersburg look down their noses at him. They say, "Oh, please, you fight natives. You fought a couple of desert skirmishes in Turkestan. 20 guys with sticks ran at you and you waved your sword. This is a real European war." There was a deep racist contempt in the capital. They called the Central Asians savages. They had absolutely no respect for the men who had force-marched 400 miles through a 100-degree desert furnace to expand the empire. So initially, Skobelev is entirely left out of the war plan. But he refuses to stay home. He packs his bags and heads to the front in Turkey as an unassigned volunteer attached to the commander-in-chief's headquarters. He doesn't have a specific role. They don't even give him a regiment to command. He ends up having to prove his right to lead men in combat during the crossing of the Danube River. On June 5, 1877, Russian amphibious assault pontoons are trying to hit the Bulgarian shore under a literal wall of Turkish lead. It's an amphibious landing. We've covered D-Day and other beachheads on this channel, so you know how brutal this is. Skobelev doesn't wait. He dives into the water, wading toward the hostile beach under point-blank enemy fire. He spots a ravine, rallies a few companies of infantry, leads them up the blind spot, and hits the Turkish defenders directly in the flank. His quick thinking completely secures the beachhead. After that, the command finally wakes up. They hand him a Cossack brigade, and shortly after, they give him a full division. Look to fully cover Skobelev's exploits during the Russo-Turkish War. We would need a 3-hour standalone episode. Let me give you the highlight reel. First, the Battle of Shipka Shenovo in January 1878. While the main Russian force is smashing its head against the Turkish front line, Skobelev takes a detachment and flanks the enemy through the mountains. His men are marching waist-deep in snow, dragging heavy artillery pieces by hand over sheer ice-covered cliffs. They drop out of the mountains right into the Turkish rear and launch a lightning strike. The Turks surrender. Second, the capture of Lovcha. This was the critical stepping stone required to launch the assault on Plevna. Here, Skobelev showed he wasn't just a cavalry cowboy, he was a master of combined arms. He micromanaged the artillery placement, orchestrating a creeping barrage that literally vaporized the Turkish trench lines right before his infantry went over the top. The city fell on August 22nd. And then the absolute meat grinder, the siege of Plevna. This was Osman Pasha's fortress. It had already repelled 2 massive Russian assaults, leaving thousands of dead in the mud. During the third assault, under apocalyptic defensive fire, Skobelev is personally leading his troops on horseback. An artillery shell detonates inches in front of him. His horse is blown to pieces. Skobelev is buried under a mountain of dirt and shrapnel. His men think he's dead. A moment later, the dirt shifts. Skobelev climbs out of the crater, draws his sword, and is the first man over the wall into the enemy redoubt. His soldiers are so fired up, they push the Turks out of the fortifications and hold the line for a full 24 hours, while the rest of the Russian army gets its act together. And finally, the winter march on Adrianople in 1878. Skobelev leads the vanguard of the army back into the mountains. 250 miles through blizzards and ice storms. In 10 days, without firing a single shot, they capture Adrianople, the second most important city in the Ottoman Empire. When the Turkish defenders realized it was Skobelev coming over the horizon, they didn't even try to fight. They dropped their weapons, abandoned their supply depots, and ran. In fact, it was the Turks who gave him the nickname, the White General, because no matter how muddy or bloody the battlefield was, he always rode into the vanguard wearing a pristine white summer tunic, sitting on a white horse. It's an incredibly cinematic, almost mythological image. He became the obsession of both his allies and his enemies. He pushes his men to within a single day's march of Constantinople. He halts and waits for the order. The Russian army is primed and ready to storm the Ottoman capital. But then grand geopolitics kicks in. Great Britain and Germany apply massive diplomatic pressure. Russia blinks. They sign a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire. Skobelev went into this war as an unassigned volunteer, mocked by the elite bureaucrats in the capital. He comes home as a living god to the Russian people. Emperor Alexander II showers him with gratitude. Skobelev is promoted to lieutenant general. He receives 2 more diamond-encrusted gold swords and the highest classes of the Order of St. Anne and the Order of St. Stanislaus. He is 35 years old, and he is undeniably the most famous military commander in the empire. In January 1880, the empire calls on him again. They send him back to Turkestan to take the fortress of Göktepe. This is the last major stronghold standing between Russia and total domination of Turkmenistan. Take the fortress, and the road to Ashgabat is wide open. 6 months earlier, a guy named General Lamakin had tried to storm this exact fortress. Lamakin was one of those guys who looked down on the locals. He thought they were just savages. But these guys had learned how to fight. Lamakin marched his men through the deep desert without securing supply lines. His soldiers arrived at the fortress, half dead, starving, dying of thirst, and exhausted by the heat. He threw them straight into an assault. What kind of combat effectiveness do you expect from men who can barely stand? Exactly. The Russians were slaughtered. It was the Empire's first major humiliating defeat in Central Asia in years. They sent Skobelev in to wash away the stain of that disgrace. Skobelev, unlike Lomakin, was a meticulous planner. He understood the logistics of desert warfare. He knew that pushing water and food through the sand was the hardest part of the job. So he didn't march his men. He ordered a railway built straight into the combat zone. He secured an ironclad supply chain of water and ammunition. On December 23rd, his troops locked down the fortress. They spend weeks digging a massive tunnel under the walls and pack it with 20 tons of high explosives. On January 12, 1881, they detonate the charge. An entire section of the fortress wall ceases to exist. The Russians pour through the breach. The fortress falls, and the entire Akalteke oasis belongs to the Tsar. Let's talk about casualties. Taking this supposedly impregnable fortress, Skobelev's army lost exactly 59 men. For this masterpiece of a campaign, he is promoted to full general of the infantry. He has finally matched the rank of his legendary grandfather. But in reality, he surpassed him because he was the youngest man in the history of the military to wear those stars. What follows is a level of nationwide idolization that his grandfather couldn't have even imagined. In March 1881, he returns to St. Petersburg. He is greeted like a conquering Caesar. But the atmosphere in the capital is incredibly dark. Just days before Skobelev arrived, terrorists finally succeeded in murdering Emperor Alexander II. The air in the city is thick with paranoia. The secret police are terrified of a mass peasant uprising. The new Tsar Alexander III immediately orders Skobelev out of the capital, assigning him to command the 4th Army Corps in Minsk. Now we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do you take your biggest superstar, your most decorated battlefield commander who just returned in triumph, and immediately exile him to a provincial garrison in Belarus? Because in January 1882, at an officers' banquet in St. Petersburg, Skobelev had a few drinks and gave a highly scandalous speech. He openly criticized the emperor's policies. He pointed out that a massive percentage of the highest-ranking jobs in the Russian government and the military were held by ethnic Germans. He basically said, "We are no longer the masters of our own house." Naturally, the Tsar's spies reported every word. Alexander III was in no mood to tolerate dissent. Terrorists had just blown his father to pieces, and now his own officers were acting like they might mutiny. Skobelev's friends and political allies tried to do damage control. They told the Tsar, "Look, the general had a bit too much champagne. Guys run their mouths when they drink. It means nothing." But it meant everything. For Skobelev, this wasn't just drunken rambling. This was his deeply held political ideology. A month later, he traveled to Paris. Rumors started swirling that he was trying to establish back-channel contacts with Russian radical populists. Word got out that he asked for a sit-down with Pyotr Lavrov, an exiled philosopher and revolutionary, hoping Lavrov could connect him with the Narodnaya Volya, the exact same terrorist group that had just assassinated the Tsar. Lavrov dodged the meeting, but Skobelev kept pushing. He held a meeting with Serbian students in Paris and invited a swarm of European journalists. With the cameras flashing, General Skobelev publicly declared that Germany and Austria-Hungary were the mortal enemies of Russia and the Slavic people. He stated that the Germans were pushing for total European domination, that Russia needed to stop taking orders from Berlin, and that a massive, apocalyptic war with Germany was inevitable. Those quotes exploded across the front pages of every newspaper in Europe. It caused a massive diplomatic incident. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, furiously demanded an explanation from St. Petersburg. Europe was in a panic. The French press started calling Skobelev the new Bonaparte, openly predicting he was going to march on St. Petersburg and launch a military coup. Skobelev just kept doubling down. He gave interviews saying the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was compromised, that the army command was compromised, and that the empire's foreign policy was fundamentally anti-Russian. He warned that when the war with Germany finally came, Russia would lose because the government was infested with a fifth column. When the Tsar heard the coup rumors, he lost his mind. He ordered Skobelev to return to Russia immediately and report directly to the imperial palace at Gatchina. Behind closed doors, Alexander III tore into him. He told the general, "You know absolutely nothing about politics, and you have zero right to air your opinions in public. If you ever pull a stunt like this again, I will strip you of your rank and throw you out of the army." People who saw Skobelev walk out of that meeting said he looked pale, crushed, and completely broken. He left Gatchina and went straight to his exile command in Minsk. To be fair, Skobelev wasn't just being paranoid about the Germans. He had very real reasons to be furious. In 1878, the Germans orchestrated the Congress of Berlin, which was a humiliating diplomatic disaster for Russia. At that table, Western diplomats stripped Russia of almost all the territorial gains they had won in the Russo-Turkish War. Everything Skobelev and his men had bled and died for was wiped away with a pen stroke. Skobelev genuinely believed that Russian diplomats with German heritage had colluded with Bismarck to intentionally sabotage Russia. He saw it as a massive coordinated conspiracy. The young Tsar Alexander III just didn't see it that way, and it ate Skobelev alive that the emperor was punishing him instead of the traitors in the cabinet. Skobelev was absolutely convinced that a catastrophic war was right around the corner, and in his mind he had no choice but to prepare to defend his country even if the government wouldn't. In May 1882, Skobelev is just 38 years old. He is completely unaware that he has only 2 months left to live. He organizes a massive full-scale inspection of his army corps in Minsk. He is drilling his troops for immediate deployment to the western border. He is running tactical simulations against a modern, regular European army, which meant, without a doubt, he was training them to fight the Germans. After the war games, Skobelev gathers his officers and gives another fiery speech. He tells them that a clash with Germany is unavoidable. He tells them the army must be ready to defend the honor of the nation, completely ignoring whatever the diplomats and the bureaucrats in St. Petersburg say. This sends the paranoia in the capital into overdrive. High command starts receiving panicked intelligence reports that Skobelev isn't just training his corps, he's preparing to march them on the capital and overthrow the Tsar. The emperor's inner circle is telling him that a military rebellion is imminent. The Germans are freaking out too. German intelligence sends reports to Berlin saying this fanatic Skobelev is planning to launch a rogue war to avenge the Congress of Berlin. The international tension is at a boiling point. Now training his troops can be explained away. He's a general. That's his job. But right around this time, Skobelev starts doing things that are much harder to explain. He starts liquidating his assets. He sells off his properties, cashes out his stocks, and empties his accounts. He amasses over 1 million rubles in cash. In 1882, that is an unfathomable amount of money, the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars today. He tells one of his close aides that he is planning to travel to Bulgaria, that a new war is going to kick off there, and he needs the cash to pay for a mercenary volunteer army. It's a very weird cover story. The much more likely reality is that Skobelev was planning to privately bankroll some kind of massive rogue operation, but to this day, nobody knows exactly what his target was. The rumor mill in the capital is spinning out of control. Whispers reach the Tsar that Skobelev was heard boasting, maybe drunk, maybe dead sober, saying, "When the emperor comes to Minsk to inspect my troops, and he gives the traditional greeting, 'How are you doing, boys?' I'll show him." There will be dead silence. Not a single soldier will cheer for him. When Alexander III heard that, I guarantee you he went to sleep every night expecting a military coup by sunrise. During these final weeks, Skobelev seems to sense that a target has been painted on his back. He becomes incredibly paranoid. He develops a severe fear of being poisoned. Before leaving Minsk, he organizes his private files, hands a thick stack of highly classified documents to his close friend, Prince Obolensky, and tells him, "I'm afraid they are going to rob me. I am not afraid of death, but I am terrified that my papers will disappear." Interestingly, those specific papers did eventually vanish from history. On the evening of June 22nd, Skobelev boards a train for Moscow. The prevailing theory is that he was going there to meet with a clandestine network of Slavic nationalists, and that seems to be exactly what happened. 3 days later, he held a secret meeting with Ivan Aksakov, the heavyweight ideologue of the Slavophile movement. Some historians believe they were drafting the architecture for an international militant pan-Slavic organization. Witnesses later claim that Skobelev handed Aksakov another cache of secret documents for safekeeping. No one knows what was in them. Some say it was his personal blueprint for a preemptive war against Germany. That night, Skobelev confided in Aksakov. He told him he was being tailed by secret police and that he genuinely feared for his life. He stayed at Aksakov's place from about 8 p.m. until 11 p.m. He was highly agitated, visibly anxious, and looked physically ill. When Aksakov asked him what was wrong, Skobelev just brushed it off, saying, "I just feel a little off. I don't feel like myself." He leaves Aksakov's house and heads to the Hotel England. He is going there to see a high society courtesan named Charlotte Altenrose. At around 1 a.m., Charlotte comes sprinting out of her room, hysterical and in tears, and tells the hotel security that a military officer has just died in her bed. The guards call the police. To avoid a massive public scandal, Skobelev's body is quickly and quietly moved across town to the Hotel Dussault, where he was actually registered as a guest. The authorities bring in Dr. Ivan Nading, a professor from Moscow University, to conduct the autopsy. And of course, in the eyes of the conspiracy theorists, it didn't help that Dr. Nading was ethnically German. The doctor signs the official death certificate, stating the cause of death is paralysis of the heart and lungs. Now, objectively, this could have been a tragic natural medical event, but Skobelev was a living legend. No one was going to accept a boring medical explanation. Within hours, the entire Russian Empire was buzzing with the absolute certainty that the White General had been assassinated. The first and loudest theory, the Germans killed him. And you can see why this caught fire. In the 1880s, Russian society was experiencing a massive wave of hyper-nationalism. The prevailing narrative was that the noble Russian army had bled to free the Slavic people in the Balkans, only for the greedy Germans to steal the victory at the negotiating table. The Russian government, the military command, and the financial sector were heavily populated by ethnic Germans. Skobelev hated them. He publicly predicted a war with them. He called out the German deep state in Russia. There were credible rumors that he was trying to collude with French hardliners to spark a two-front war against Berlin. So if you look at it from a geopolitical angle, German intelligence had every motive in the world to eliminate him, and the circumstances of his death were incredibly convenient. Charlotte Altenrose was an Austrian of German descent. She had only been in Moscow for 3 years. It would have been child's play for her to orchestrate a hit. Skobelev walked in with zero security detail, slipping a lethal dose of poison into a glass of wine for a guy who had already been drinking. Easy work. But there's a catch. The German political machine of that era, run by Bismarck, didn't really do black ops assassinations. Bismarck was obsessed with the reputation of the German state. Plus, the hit is almost too obvious. Why would German spies assassinate their biggest critic in the hotel room of a German woman? It's basically leaving a calling card. If they wanted him dead, it would have made way more sense to poison him in his own room at the Hotel Dussault, where there were no witnesses. Also, the Russian police never charged Charlotte with a crime, and she quietly slipped out of the country shortly after, which actually fueled the fire for the conspiracy theorists. If a foreign agent killed the most famous general in the country and was allowed to just walk across the border, that means her protectors were sitting at the very top of the Russian government. Which brings us to theory number 2. The assassination was ordered by the Tsar's inner circle, or perhaps by Alexander III himself. Inside Russia, people only whispered this theory behind closed doors, but the European press printed it openly. According to this narrative, Skobelev was murdered by a black ops group called the Holy Brotherhood. I've mentioned them before when we talked about Alexander II. The Holy Brotherhood was a shadow syndicate of ultra-wealthy aristocrats formed immediately after the Tsar was blown up. Their mission was to protect the monarchy and crush the revolutionary terrorists using the terrorists' own methods: espionage, entrapment, provocation, and targeted assassinations. The roster included some of the most powerful families in the empire: the Vorontsovs, the Dashkovs, the Shuvalovs. Sergei Witte was involved. The entire operation was commanded by the Tsar's own brother, Grand Duke Vladimir. At its peak, the Brotherhood had 800 operatives. They ran a massive network of deep cover agents, spying on suspicious individuals inside Russia and hunting down dissidents across Europe. They even funded fake underground newspapers, disguising them as radical propaganda to sow paranoia and infighting among the revolutionary cells. It's highly probable that the Holy Brotherhood initially tried to recruit Skobelev. When he refused to play ball and when the rumors of his impending military coup reached fever pitch, they decided the white general had to go. The deep state genuinely believed he was going to march his army on St. Petersburg. What gives this theory some serious weight is how the government censors handled the fallout. The facts were simple. Skobelev got drunk and died in the bed of a courtesan. It's an embarrassing, messy situation, but the state-controlled newspapers aggressively pushed a completely different narrative. They reported that the great hero died peacefully, entirely alone in his own suite at the Hotel Dussault. Now, you could argue the censors were just trying to protect the pristine legacy of a national hero, but covering up the crime scene is exactly what a state-sponsored hit squad would do. However, there is a piece of context that throws a wrench into this theory. By the summer of 1882, the Holy Brotherhood was actually falling apart. They had started a turf war with the official Department of Police and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The official cops thought the Brotherhood's black ops methods were dangerous and uncontrollable, and the Tsar himself was starting to get nervous about a secret, heavily armed society of aristocrats operating outside the law. By the summer of 1882, the official state security apparatus was heavily pressuring the Brotherhood to disband. Did the timeline of their shutdown happen before or after Skobelev's death? We don't know for sure, but by 1883, the Brotherhood was completely dissolved. So the idea that the Tsar's friends orchestrated a hit on Russia's greatest general to save the throne remains the most popular, credible theory among the educated elite in St. Petersburg and Moscow at the time. And then there is theory number 3. Because we can't do history without a little tinfoil hat conspiracy. And back then, this one was a blockbuster. Skobelev was assassinated by the Freemasons. This theory was incredibly popular among the hardcore Slavic nationalists. They viewed Skobelev as the ultimate savior of the Slavic race, the man destined to break the invisible chains of German control and unite the East against the global Masonic cabal. This bizarre theory actually got some traction thanks to Juliette Adam, a prominent figure in the French nationalist movement. In 1882, she was working closely with Leon Gambetta, the former Prime Minister of France. Skobelev had met with Gambetta during his controversial trip to Paris. Gambetta was a known high-ranking member of the Grand Orient de France Masonic Lodge. The conspiracy goes that Skobelev infiltrated the lodge, uncovered the dark secrets of the global brotherhood, and they murdered him to keep him quiet. Let's play devil's advocate. Let's assume there really was a shadowy Franco-German Masonic deep state trying to control Russia. If that were true, Skobelev would definitely be a threat. But why on earth would the Masons assassinate him right when he was actively trying to build an alliance with them? It makes zero sense. A living, breathing Skobelev leading a military coup in Russia would have immediately aligned St. Petersburg with Paris. He was exactly the weapon the French nationalists needed. So the Masonic hit squad theory belongs in the trash. The truth is, the Russian public violently rejected the idea of a natural death because it felt wrong. It offended their sense of narrative. Nobody wanted to accept that a titan of war, a man who had survived thousands of bullets, exploding artillery shells, and brutal desert campaigns, was taken out by a random heart attack after a few too many drinks. But let's look at the medical reality. We actually have detailed accounts of his final moments. While he was in the room with Charlotte, someone knocked on the door from the hallway. A voice said, "The Russian officers in the next room want to send a toast to the health of our great general," and a glass of champagne was handed through the door. Initially, Skobelev didn't drink it, but later, after engaging in some strenuous physical activity with Charlotte, he got thirsty, grabbed the champagne, downed it, and immediately collapsed. When they moved his body back to his own hotel, witnesses reported that rigor mortis set in almost instantly, and his skin broke out in dark blue patches. Now, some amateur sleuths will tell you that is a textbook symptom of potassium cyanide poisoning, but the medical evidence points in a much more depressing direction. Dr. Nading, who performed the autopsy, was absolutely certain it was massive cardiac arrest. Furthermore, Skobelev's close friend, Prince Obolensky, spoke privately with the surgeons who opened the general's chest. They told him that for a man in his 30s, Skobelev's heart was in catastrophic condition. The tissue was completely degraded. The doctors were actually stunned he had managed to live as long as he did. This was backed up by Skobelev's own personal physician from his Turkestan campaigns, Dr. Oskar Geifelder. Years earlier, out in the desert, the doctor had diagnosed Skobelev with severe cardiac insufficiency and warned him he was at extreme risk for a massive coronary event. For a guy of his size and build, Skobelev had a faint, weak pulse, and his heartbeat was rapid and muffled. The doctor told him his cardiovascular system was a ticking time bomb. With a diagnosis like that, you are supposed to retire to a quiet country house and avoid stress. Skobelev did the exact opposite. He spent a decade on the absolute bleeding edge of combat, enduring grueling forced marches, extreme heat, freezing mountains, and the constant adrenaline dump of being under fire. Those campaigns carved his name into history, but they absolutely shredded his physical body. Add to that the intense psychological trauma of his final years. He went through a brutal divorce with Maria Gagarina, the daughter of a famous diplomat. When they married in 1874, it was a love match. He thought she would be his anchor. But just 2 weeks after the wedding, he left her in the capital and went back to the wars in Central Asia. He refused to live in St. Petersburg. She refused to live in a dusty frontier garrison. While he was out conquering khanates, she was lighting up the high society ballrooms and taking lovers. To be fair, the white general wasn't exactly a saint when it came to fidelity either. 2 years later, they filed for divorce. Skobelev put on a brave face in public. He joked with his officers that a woman is a soldier's worst enemy, but his inner circle knew the divorce devastated him. He returned every single penny of her dowry and refused to ever look at her again. Then came the darkest blow. Right after the Russo-Turkish War, his mother was murdered in the most horrific way imaginable. She had traveled to the Balkans to work as a Red Cross nurse, carrying a massive amount of cash for charity. Her carriage was ambushed on the road. They stole the money and slaughtered her. The worst part, the leader of the gang was a Russian officer, Skobelev's own former orderly, a man the family had completely trusted. You take all of that trauma, a guy who was naturally high-strung and explosive since childhood, the brutal divorce, the betrayal and murder of his mother, the physical toll of a dozen wars, then he falls out of political favor, he starts drinking heavily, he gets into a screaming match with the Emperor of Russia, He is exiled to Minsk, living in a state of constant suffocating paranoia. Vasily Nemirovich Danchenko, a famous war correspondent who rode with Skobelev at Plevna and became one of his closest friends, was one of the last people to see him alive. He later wrote a biography of the general. Danchenko didn't believe in the poison or the spies. He believed that Mikhail Skobelev simply burned to ash from the inside out. In 38 years, he lived 5 lifetimes, and in every single one of those lives, he pushed the engine past the red line. The brilliant student, the fearless cavalryman, the genius of the general staff, the father to his soldiers. He never once spared himself. His body was battered by shrapnel, exhausted by the desert, and ground down by unimaginable psychological pressure. And one night in Moscow, the engine just finally gave out. The day they buried General Skobelev, the sky opened up and it poured freezing rain. It didn't matter. A crowd of 60,000 people flooded the streets of Moscow. People traveled from the furthest corners of the empire just to stand in the rain. His coffin was laid out in the Church of All Saints on the Arbat. The crowds were so dense that the surrounding streets were completely impassable. When the service ended, they didn't put the coffin on a carriage. His officers, his fellow generals, and his enlisted men lifted the heavy wooden box onto their shoulders and carried it by hand through the pouring rain for nearly 4 miles to the train station. They placed him on a train heading for his family estate in the Ryazan province. As the train rolled through the Russian countryside, the tracks were lined with tens of thousands of peasants. The people who couldn't make it to Moscow just stood by the rails, taking off their hats as the train passed. Russia had never seen a funeral like it. He was buried in the family crypt right next to his mother and his grandfather. In 1907, the Moscow City Duma finally pushed to build a monument for him. They argued that Moscow, the heart of Russia, needed to immortalize the nation's greatest tactical genius. Initially, the bureaucrats fought it. They said, "He wasn't from Moscow. Why should we pay for his statue?" But the military took over. They opened a public crowdfunding campaign. In 2 years, regular citizens donated 50,000 rubles, a massive sum. They held a design competition judged entirely by combat veterans who demanded absolute historical accuracy. 27 sculptors submitted designs. The winner was a self-taught artist named Pyotr Samanov, who happened to be a retired army colonel. He designed a monument that captured exactly who Skobelev was. A massive bronze of the white general on a rearing horse sword drawn, flanked by gritty, realistic statues of his infantrymen. Every detail, the weapons, the medals, the folds of the uniforms was flawlessly accurate. The art critics hated it. A guy from the Imperial Academy of Arts called it crude, amateurish, and devoid of artistic merit. The soldiers told him to shut up. The monument was unveiled in 1912 on the 30th anniversary of Skobelev's death. It didn't stand for long. In 1918, the Bolsheviks seized power. They immediately ordered the monument destroyed. They tore down the white general and replaced him with a cheap Soviet Statue of Liberty, which stood there until 1941. If you go to Moscow today and you walk past the mayor's office, you'll see a massive statue of Yuri Dolgoruki. That is exactly where Skobelev used to stand. The communists systematically erased him. They blew up his monument in Turkestan. They destroyed his statues in Warsaw and Bialystok. The Bolsheviks branded him a great Russian chauvinist. But the reality is the Red Army couldn't tolerate the memory of the ultimate white general. Back at his family estate in Spasskoye, Skobelev's sister had fulfilled his final wish. She turned the mansion into a sanctuary for disabled combat veterans. It was fully funded. Soldiers who had lost limbs or their health in the Empire's wars were given free housing, food, tailored uniforms, and top-tier medical care. It was an elite brotherhood. You could only get in if you had medals for valor under fire. The veterans maintained strict military discipline. Their main duty was standing an honor guard at the family church where Skobelev was buried. They prayed for his soul every single day. When the revolution came, the local peasants, in the grand tradition of class warfare, looted the estate and burned it to the ground. A Soviet commissar sent a report to Moscow detailing the destruction. The terraces are smashed, the wallpaper ripped down, the walls and ceilings torn open. They ripped the metal fixtures out of the stoves, stole everything of value, and drove off the livestock. In 1938, local communist officials broke into Skobelev's tomb. They were looking for his diamond swords and gold medals. They didn't find them. Tomb raiders had already beaten them to it. But they did strip the leather boots off the general's corpse. They didn't even bother to close the lid of the sarcophagus. The locals eventually dismantled the family mausoleum brick by brick to build sheds. The open graves of the Skobelev family sat exposed to the rain and snow for decades. It wasn't until the 1960s that someone finally cleaned up the debris and sealed the crypt. For nearly a century, his name was buried. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the ghost of the white general finally returned. For his 160th anniversary, the ruined church at Spasskoy was restored. 5 years later, they opened a museum on the grounds of his burned-out estate. In 2014, a brand new monument to Skobelev was finally erected in Moscow. His name was officially restored to the pantheon of Russia's greatest military commanders. It's a dark, heavy story. A man who possessed a generational genius for war, who hated the political games of the capital, and who just wanted to fight for his country. Maybe he was planning a coup to save the empire from itself. Maybe he was just a paranoid soldier broken by PTSD. We will never truly know. But his exile and his premature death benefited absolutely no one. Not him, not the Tsar, and certainly not the Russian Empire. He was a supernova who was ultimately consumed by the gravity of his own legend. Because no Tsar before or since was ever mourned by the people the way they mourned Mikhail Skobelev. If this era of history pulls you in, you might have missed some of our deeper dives. We have a massive series on the Romanov dynasty. I mentioned Alexander II and Alexander III today, and you should absolutely check out our episode on the era of Nicholas I. I also did a full breakdown on the abolition of serfdom. If you haven't seen that one, it perfectly sets the stage for everything we talked about tonight. Go give it a watch. Thank you for spending your time with us digging through these forgotten pages of history. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell so you don't miss a thing. We've got a lot more stories coming, and you're going to want to be here for them. Until next time.